Before we start, I just wanted to say that earlier in the morning, I was deeply moved by the fireside chat conversation between the President of Iceland and the former President of Ireland. I am from Ecuador, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny country in Latin America, and the only time that we had a female president in 1998, she lasted in power for 24 hours before Congress decided to remove her from power and seat a man instead. Oh. Now I'm living in the US, and in the recent week, I don't know if you've heard, but in the recent week, the US population decided not to elect a female president for the second time and instead elect Donald Trump. And that, I think, has a certain gravitas to it. And so a lot of the conversations recently have been centered around the role of men, and especially young men, as a part of that process. And I know that we all understand that it's not as simplistic as men didn't want the female president, and that's why we don't have her. But I do think that we are here concerned about those young men and wanting to understand more of them. So I would like Gary to try and provide some answers for all of us.
Where to start? Well, first off, thanks for the invitation to the event. I had been preparing, like many of you, for many months, if not years, to be able to get to say Madam President in my own country. That did not happen, but I did get to say Madam President to two amazing Madam Presidents this morning, Hala and Mary. So thank you for that, Iceland and Ireland, while we figure out where to go. I'm going to start off by saying I don't bring good news, that's kind of an obvious way to start, but we have been studying now for the last 15 years doing household surveys with men and women, covering all regions of the world. And every country that we have looked at in the last 15 years, young men, ages 18 to 25, are less likely to believe in gender equality than their fathers' or grandfathers' generation. Hold that again. Around the world, young men going backwards on gender equality. Young women, in the meantime, are demanding it more than they ever have. We have to ask the question, why are we moving backwards with young men? What is up? There's a multiple and a complex situation going on. One is there's a crisis of connection. Whether we look in Europe, the US, you can look in South Korea. I heard examples from Kenya in the session before. We've got young men who are less connected, less invested in their communities, and more likely to be alone and lonely than ever before. In the US, 60% of young men told us, no one really knows me. 40% told us they have thought about suicide in the past 2 weeks. A third tell us that on a weekly basis, they don't see anyone outside their home. Second big aspect to this is a sense of economic precarity. Young men around the world telling us they do not think they will achieve the standard of living that their father or grandfather has had. So there's an existential crisis there. Now, when that comes up to us as feminist allies and feminists, we say, well, women have never had that equality. They never had that chance. That isn't sitting well with men. In the midst of those two crises, we have the third portion of that, which is a group of individuals, including some who just won the presidency in the US and their allies, who have figured out how to speak to men in compassionate ways. We have too often brushed off the stress and that economic precarity of men, but Trump and Rogan and Musk and Andrew Tate, and the list of names goes on. They are seeing men, they are seeing, we see you, they don't, and we see what happens in elections, we see what happens online. You as women politicians are living the anger, the hatred, the misogyny that's coming out. Whether it is young men in Korea putting cameras in women's restrooms, whether it's a new line coming out on social media after Trump's win that her body, my choice, that came out from the online influencer Nick Fuentes, we continue to see this onslaught of hate and anger. Now here's where I'm going to switch gears a little bit and say, in the midst of all that, we've got to stop how we talk to young men. Because what they also perceive from us on the left is that we talk at them, we don't listen to them, that we are not stepping into the conversations with them with a sense of compassion. I know how tough that is to talk about a sense of compassion to men who seem to be spewing anger and hate. But I do think, and as Jose asked me to keep on point here, I think that is where we have to step into the conversation. This is about calling out the men who bring harm, but we've got to find ways that we call in all men to be part of this cause. I'll just finish on a personal note, which is I'm a girl dad. Had the amazing opportunity of co-raising with my amazing partner, a girl in the 90s and the early 2000s. She's now 26. And in many ways, it was easy to point, what does empowered womanhood look like? Because she could see it in her mother, because we could see it in new superheroes, the new takes on fairy tales where princesses did not need to be rescued by anyone. They could rescue themselves with their sisters, thank you very much. She could wear a tutu in the morning and play astronaut in the afternoon. The scripts were easy. It was easy to buy Teen Vogue for her and know that as a teenager she was reading feminist stuff. We have not come up with a similar framework and space for young men. We haven't come up with those new scripts. In fact, the social media space, the manosphere, where so many men are hanging out and swarmed with this information every day, we have not figured out the ways to talk to them. Those that are providing positive messages in the spaces where young men are hanging out reach maybe 100,000. They don't reach the 2 million that Tate had the week after he got arrested. The Republican Party in the US spent 8 times the amount advertising to young men than the Democratic Party did. We've got to figure out how we talk to young men. And I would say that the simplest place that I would conclude is to say it's time to stop indicting and start inviting. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm left with that idea that you mentioned of that crisis of connection. And I think, Larry, maybe because of your experience with data-driven insights and storytelling, you could maybe provide some light towards how can we leverage that power in order to be able to engage and connect with young men.
Sure. This is awesome, by the way. This is like a mind-blowing experience to be in this round and also have the shortest bathroom line ever. So, you know, our company focuses on data, and the data set that we're actually creating looks at inclusion signals across gender, across race, and those diversity experiences were started just out of a need to like provide a new insight to the bigger sort of models that were out there. So, but when I started this, the first thing because you know, I'm Black, American, and we did our first study on inclusion, and I thought, okay, I'm going to see the emotionality of Black people, of underrepresented people pop feeling unincluded in content. But actually, it was white men who felt the most microaggressed in content. How they were being represented in advertising and in shows, really, they felt emotional, they felt unincluded, and it blew my mind. Because I'm like, well, no, I went into this to prove like the point that, you know, we are the ones that are harmed and having this sort of cycle happen. And what ended up coming out in our data set is, you know, the men were feeling this. And so, you know, fast forwarding that to, we start to double click into like, what's driving this? And what, you know, it's the mainstream media versus their media. So 72% of Twitch viewers are men. And the guys are there watching other guys play video games. And the video games themselves are about saving distressed women, that are about killing each other, the hyper-competitiveness, the echo chamber of actual bullying that happens in these spaces between men starts to drive them into this point of hyper-masculinity, right? And you're in this on your own, by yourself, most guys 20 hours a week, not talking to anyone, playing a video game, getting shouted out by another guy in his ear the entire time. And then when we ask them to, pay attention to this because it's really important, they're like, wait, what are you talking about? First of all, every time I look at that, I look ridiculous. Yeah. And you're not engaged in anything that I'm actually interested in. So I'm going to go back into my world. And that's where these guys are lurking, right? That's where these guys sort of come in and create, in a vacuum of logic and facts, they create this cult these cult of personalities that draw guys deeper and deeper into sort of an echo chamber of hypermasculinity. So like the counterbalance to that is be where, go to your audience, be where they are, understand the context in which they are now experiencing the world, which is oftentimes alone in front of a screen with a headset on. And so, breaking that cycle, I think younger, I have a son, he's 11. Little known fact about me, I was a chief brand officer for HBO Max. I named it after my son. He loves that, and he's so proud of that. And every 2 months, Max asks, can I get a console game? All my friends have them. And we're like, no, you can't. And the amount of frustration that he has it's like overwhelming, because the pressure from all of his boys is get online because we're all on there. We're playing Madden. Why are you not playing Madden? It's a culture in which a lot of us have moved on from, and they're stuck there by themselves, really. And they have virtual selves to play with, and it's creating, the emotional harm of 20 hours of negative reinforcement and just competitive shouting is insane. Sorry, I can just go on. Give me a light.
No, thank you so much. And I think that idea of meeting them where they're at, I think it's crucial and something that needs to linger in our heads for a bit longer. And Einar, I'm curious, when we were in the living room, before this living room, you were mentioning that for the problems or for the situation right now, the traditional approaches are not necessarily enough, and that we need to look for new types of solutions. So I'm curious about, from the local government sphere, what are those lessons or what are those things that we can look forward to doing?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the invitation. This is a really interesting panel here, and thank you for the groundwork that you've laid out here. I think what I mentioned is that, policy matters, of course. We have a strong gender policy in the city of Reykjavik that kind of trickles down into every part of our operations. But I feel like even though we have policies and then we're continuously implementing them, but the society is a moving target. We are always changing. We have new challenges that we're facing. As you mentioned, Andrew Tate, all those influencers that are kind of shifting the dynamics in the discussions about genders and basically human rights. And then we have elections in the US, where you have voter behavior giving legitimacy to destructive views towards gender and the roles. So, and that impacts us here in Iceland, of course, and everywhere. So this is a continuous battle on trying to connect with young people, young men, and of course women and girls. So I am fortunate enough to be, I grew up with a female president. Vigdís Finnbogadóttir, who was the first democratically elected president in the world, completely influenced me on the way how I perceive power. We're used to see men with power, but growing up with a woman who's in charge influences not only girls as a role model, but boys, definitely. So leadership matters very much. And then we've had female prime ministers and ministers and mayors, and so that matters not only for girls, it matters for boys. But what I kind of take out when I think about, because your very strong speech here, Gary, about how do we connect with boys, and this kind of feeling of thousands of boys being disconnected from society. I always come down to the fact that we see in the statistics is this untreated trauma of violence, physical violence, sexual violence that boys have been subjected to. And we see it in the data. 1 out of every 6 in Iceland. And when we look at the prison data, almost every prisoner has been subjected to violence. And it's untreated. We have not been addressing those traumas that are all over our communities. And maybe because of this masculinity, this idea of the strong man, you know, we are kind of, they are not maybe receptive of this conversation, and we as a community are not, you know, brave enough to kind of take the spotlight out of women who are by far more subjected to violence. But we need to go back to the roots. Why are men committing those offenses? So I think we need to engage this trauma, and then we can, you know, kind of break down those walls of masculinity and being this strong man, kind of. That. So this discussion takes me here.
No, thank you so much, Einar, for that. I think when we think about the representation of women or women being in power, we of course jump to the idea of what the effects and impact of that has for girls. But I do think that for boys as well, the idea of reconstruct or deconstruct what power can be, it's quite powerful, for lack of a better word, as I'd say, in terms of getting men to understand that gender equality is also good for them. So I really appreciate that idea, especially of that policy matters, but changing culture matters as well. And thinking of that, Drita, at the national level and through your experience as a representative of civil society that has transitioned into being a parliamentarian, I'm curious about what are the lessons that you can bring from your own context into this conversation.
Well, first of all, allow me to thank the organizers for the invitation. I feel really honored and privileged to be in this room full of amazing people. I think there is no better place than Iceland to discuss these topics in this moment in history. Now, from the perspective of a member of the parliament, I kind of avoid calling myself entirely a lawmaker, although I am a lawmaker because of my versatile background, but I hope to contribute through my experience to the discussion. So society codifies its values into laws. So usually the road, or I believe how it must look like, is that norms become values, and those values are codified into law. So first of all, we need phenomenons to be normalized. Having more men doing care at work, having more women in politics, and so on. And on that note, women parliamentarians, I've heard earlier today that being that this year was quite consequential for the number of countries that had elections, and if I'm not mistaken, only 0.6% more women we have in parliaments. Which, of course, is not what we expected, thinking that our societies are progressing. But the role of women in parliament is pivotal, for sure, because we need men and women, but I'm speaking from the perspective of women, to be really determined to turn their beliefs into social values, and then from their position to turn them into laws. So how to do that? You mentioned that I do have a background in social activism. I really believe that the solution is in a bottom-up approach. Because when we think of change, I mean, change starts with an idea. Now, we can come up with ideas in a room of people, of an elite, a political, intellectual elite, and then just offer it to the society. Or we can have ideas born within the community from everyday life. I believe that the latter is the solution. So for that, we do need a robust activism. And we must not overlook that there are basic needs. You know, I mean, my experience in social activism was a little bit more comfortable because I could focus on a niche. But when I became a politician, my constituency was so diverse. So I really had to think of different perspectives and reconcile and build a common vision of my constituency. But I said we should not overlook putting a reference here on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs and work up from there. Alongside that, I don't think that action and research, continuing research, are mutually exclusive. We do need continuing research in order to first see where we're standing, but create a realistic outlook of the future. So where our generation will go, how will what kind of changes we will produce within this generation. But it is important to talk with facts. And another thing is, I think that the new generation of politicians, including myself and other peers of mine, have found ourselves in a situation where society have not found itself for the past many decades. I think this is a crucial moment. So there are two dimensions of our political activism. One dimension is taking care of the needs of our constituency, and another dimension is, because we all come from different contexts. I mean, I come from a country in the Western Balkans, which, it's different in many ways from, for example, Iceland or some other country. So we also need to follow these developments on many levels, also on a global level, and make the best decisions. But, challenging times such as this are also an opportunity for new leaders and for change. So I'm quite optimistic, and I think we must be optimistic. It's just a moment that we need to reflect on what went wrong, be honest, and also be real. Be real have a realistic expectation of what may happen, of what can happen in the future. Sometimes as a progressive, that's hard because you want change to happen faster. But, the reality comes by and it somehow puts you back on the ground. But as I said, again, there is room for optimism. We just need robust social activism that starts from the community level, starts at home, challenging the worldviews of people, members of our family, and then within the community. And also, like one last note, I mentioned I come from a country which is actually a front runner in the EU integration, Montenegro, from the Western Balkans. And I often see, when you have this vision of becoming part of the Western world and what those Western values are. So you kind of need to translate them into local level, what they mean. So to illustrate what I meant by the challenges that the new generation of politicians face today is you have to believe in Western values, in those values that we agree, rule of law and gender equality and so on. But at the same time, be mindful that, certain, shifts may be just temporary. So again, on the note of optimism, I think that we have plenty of room for optimism as well.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I think that idea of centering the conversation on what those values are and optimism can be quite powerful. And Gary, you were mentioning before the need for a new script. I think if any of you have had the misfortune of encountering Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson or like Ben Shapiro or any of those voices on the internet, you'll see that they have quite a clear recipe of what masculinity should be. So push your shoulders back, clean your room, go work out, you'll get money, you'll get girls, and this is what success looks like. I'm a director of communications, and I struggle quite a few with trying to convey what our vision of masculinity is. It's hard because it's nuanced. It has to do with the potentiality of being everything that you would want to be. It has to be with emotions. It has to be with being in contact with yourself, but it's not as formulaic and it's not as clear. So given that I have the four of you here, what is that new script according to you? What is the message that we should push or that we should try and send to these young men to say this is the masculinity that we would want to see?
Well, I think it's, first of all, we've got to get higher upstream, right? And so what that means is influencing how these guys are perceiving just like themselves. And a lot of times they're literally avatars in games. How many female video game engineers are there? Almost none. How many executives at these gaming companies? The whole generation of movie making and TV show influence is over, right? There's this gap that is of our perception of how to communicate with men, because we're using an old model. Like, by the way, Nick Fuentes is not an influencer; he's a white supremacist. Like, and that also is like kind of the problem too, because we kind of normalize psychos in a way and like give them a place at the table in a conversation when he should be shunned by society, right? And so like we should just call people what they are and really start addressing what is the core of what's happening. There's a disconnect in how we all perceive the way into men's lives and how men are living their lives, and boys especially. Everyone thinks boys are at home, right? They're fine if they're at home, but they're literally in their own head, and they're being influenced by these video games, by the social media that echoes what's happening in there. 20 billion hours in 2023 on Twitch alone. And we never talk about it. We never talk about Twitch. We talk about Meta. We talk about everything else. They're over there having a whole life in these video games that we're not even scratching the surface on from a policy perspective either.
Yeah, but also it's an opportunity for the conversation. We have schools. We have platforms for discussions with our children, with our boys who need, a platform for adult supervised discussions about the damaging ideas that those influencers are pushing towards them every day. So that's where cities, towns come in. We have this way to communicate, to guide, and do it responsibly. And we have all genders around the table, and we can have those discussions. The bright side of Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, and all those guys is that we have now something to talk about, and we can.
Well, I think that we also must see it for what I believe it is. It's in the end of the day, it's a battle of ideas. You can win over on the grounds of who has better ideas. We can easily slip into cancel culture. Is that the solution, or do we need to offer ideas and how we lay them out? What are the short-term benefits? What are the long-term benefits? So, I believe that it is a battle of ideas. As I said, change starts with ideas, and then you turn those ideas into norms, norms into values, values into laws, and so on. But yes, it is a battle of ideas, and we must do more to present, okay, this is the better solution based on arguments, based on tangible benefits for people. So, that would be my take on your question.
I was going to pick up on Larry, your point on Twitch. We did a deep dive into this whole ecosystem of online lives of young men last year, about 6 months with a whole research team looking across, including Twitch. And it's easy to fall into panic and to focus on the bad voices out there. But about 70% of what we saw was either innocuous or positive. It was young men trying to find other young men like them. And in focus groups with young men, they said, well, what do you find there? And they basically said, other guys who are like us dealing with the same struggles. And on Twitch, you can follow a streamer who is the guy playing the game. They're almost always guys. You're following him. If he throws in a misogynist content, it ripples through. And it may be 200,000 down of that many followers watching this particular streamer. But the handful, there were a couple, of the, say, 2 out of 10 that we saw who said something positive, if they called out a racist or homophobic comment, it stopped. So there is a possibility of calling guys in for good. What they were very clear when we asked the question of what could be done to amplify the good, they said it can't be you all, because you don't know how to do it. But we can come up with it ourselves if you trust us to be our best selves. And so I think we've got to figure out a way that we are calling out that harm, but calling guys into the good stuff that we think they want to do. And I think I know you brought up the issue of trauma. So a lot of young men who talk about how they experience that, they experience cyberbullying, they experience that voice in the ear, Larry, that you talked about, as harmful and critical and as is a form of violence toward them. And so I think, if there's a way out of this, I would say I do believe that if we care for boys and men, the experiences they're going through, the traumas they experience, the way that they are roped into a box of manhood that doesn't let us be fully caring humans. I think if we care for them, they become caring humans.
And I think that with that parting thought of centering care as a part of the conversation, I think we can say thank you to each of you, Drita, Einar, Larry, and Gary, and to everyone else. I promise that I won't dance off the stage either, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.